A federal appeals court has ruled that President Trump's sweeping global tariffs are unconstitutional. So what does that mean for Trump's trade policy now?
Just moments ago, actually, a federal appeals court ruled most of President Trump's tariffs are illegal. The court is saying the president exceeded his authority.
It's just vital for the country, vital.
President Trump's tariffs are in legal limbo as the Supreme Court decides whether it will hear a case that could sway the future of the president's economic agenda. A loss at the court would be a major setback for the White House.
Donald Trump built his political brand on the promise of America first. Tariffs were at the heart of that vision. He claimed that by taxing imports from other countries, whether it was steel from China, aluminum from Canada, or electronics from Europe, he would bring manufacturing back to America, strengthen the economy, and protect American workers. It was a bold vision, one that electrified his base and struck fear into America's trading partners. But now, years later, the consequences of those policies are becoming impossible to ignore. A movement is growing to refund more than $1 trillion in tariffs collected under Trump's policies. This is a staggering number, and if it becomes reality, it will not just be a financial blow. It will be a political earthquake, erasing one of Trump's most defining achievements. Welcome to Traveling Vibes. If this is your first time here, make sure you subscribe to Traveling Vibes because tonight we are diving into one of the most shocking and high-stakes political and economic stories of our time. A $1 trillion tariff refund is on the horizon, and if it happens, it could destroy the foundation of Donald Trump's political legacy. This is not just a story about numbers. This is about power, control, and the future of America's trade policies. Over the next 2 hours, we're going to unpack every layer of this crisis, from the backroom deals in Washington to the struggles of American families living with the ripple effects of these tariffs. To understand how we got here, let's go back to 2017. Donald Trump had just taken office, and one of his earliest moves was to declare war on what he called unfair trade practices. His administration argued that countries like China had been exploiting the U.S. for decades, taking advantage of free trade agreements and flooding American markets with cheap goods. Tariffs were presented as a weapon to level the playing field, forcing other countries to pay a price for access to the American market. In theory, this sounded like a winning strategy. Trump repeatedly promised that China and other countries would pay for these tariffs. But in reality, it was American companies and consumers who bore the cost. Tariffs are essentially taxes, and when importers paid them, those costs were passed down to manufacturers, retailers, and ultimately, ordinary Americans. Over the years, these tariffs added billions of dollars in extra costs to everything from household appliances to groceries. At first, Trump's supporters celebrated the tariffs as a symbol of strength. Headlines declared that America was finally standing up for itself. But behind the scenes, the damage was spreading. Manufacturers who relied on imported parts saw costs skyrocket. Farmers, who depend on export markets, faced devastating retaliatory tariffs from China and Europe, leaving them with crops they couldn't sell. Even small businesses were crushed under the rising costs of raw materials. Fast forward to today. We're now seeing the long-term consequences of those decisions. Over $1 trillion in tariffs were collected under Trump's policies, and a coalition of corporations, trade groups, and even foreign governments is demanding that money back. They argue that many of Trump's tariffs were not just economically harmful, but also legally questionable. Lawsuits have been filed, claiming that Trump overstepped his authority when he declared certain imports a national security threat, a legal justification that allowed him to bypass Congress and impose tariffs unilaterally. If these lawsuits succeed, the U.S. government may be forced to refund this money. That would mean $1 trillion payout to corporations and foreign trade partners, an unprecedented financial move that would rock Washington to its core. For Trump, this would be a devastating blow to his brand as a strong negotiator and trade warrior. His entire campaign and presidency were built on the idea that his tariffs were a success, a necessary step to protect American workers. A refund would be an admission that those policies failed. But this isn't just about Trump. This is about the future of America's trade policy and its global reputation. The Biden administration is under intense pressure to settle these disputes quietly, to avoid a catastrophic trade war that could further destabilize the global economy. Allies like Canada, Europe, and Japan are pushing for refunds as a gesture of goodwill, while rivals like China see this as a chance to prove that America's protectionist policies have backfired. The $1 trillion refund isn't just a legal battle. It's a symbol of a much larger fight over America's identity in the global economy. Are we a nation that embraces free trade, even if it means painful adjustments for workers? Or are we a protectionist powerhouse, willing to impose tariffs and fight trade wars to protect American industries? Trump staked his entire legacy on the latter, and now the cracks in that strategy are starting to show. Let's examine the numbers. $1 trillion is a staggering sum of money. It's more than the annual budget of the entire U.S. military. It's more than the GDP of most countries. If refunded, this money would not go to everyday Americans but to corporations, importers, and international businesses that paid these tariffs. That's why this story is so controversial. Supporters of the refund argue that these companies were unfairly penalized and that returning the money would help stabilize supply chains, lower prices, and repair America's global relationships. Opponents say that handing back $1 trillion to corporations while working families struggle with inflation would be political suicide. The legal arguments are complex but critical. Trump used a section of U.S. trade law known as Section 232, which allows the president to impose tariffs on imports deemed a threat to national security. Critics argue that Trump abused this power by applying it far too broadly. Steel and aluminum from Canada, for example, were labeled a national security threat, despite Canada being one of America's closest allies. Legal experts say this was a stretch at best and unconstitutional at worst. If the courts agree, it could set a precedent limiting the president's ability to impose tariffs in the future, effectively dismantling Trump's trade strategy. Inside the White House, this issue is a nightmare for Biden. On one hand, he doesn't want to be seen as defending Trump's tariffs. On the other hand, authorizing $1 trillion payout to corporations is politically toxic. That's why the administration is reportedly exploring settlements, partial refunds, quiet negotiations with foreign governments, and new trade deals that would allow both sides to save face. But no matter how this plays out, Trump's image as a master negotiator is already under fire. For Trump's supporters, this is proof of a conspiracy. At his rallies, Trump has been railing against what he calls the globalist elites who are trying to erase his achievements. He argues that the tariffs were working, that China was finally paying a price for decades of exploitation, and that the refund is nothing more than a scheme to make him look weak. This message resonates with his base, who see Trump as the only leader willing to stand up for American workers. But the reality is more complicated. Many of the companies pushing for refunds are American companies. They're manufacturers, farmers, and retailers who bore the brunt of the tariffs. They argue that the tariffs hurt American workers by making it more expensive to produce goods in the U.S. These companies say that refunding the money would allow them to reinvest in American jobs and rebuild their supply chains. This isn't a simple battle of globalists versus patriots. It's a complex economic war with no easy answers. For everyday Americans, this trillion-dollar fight might feel distant, but its effects are everywhere. Tariffs have raised the price of everything from cars to washing machines to groceries. Farmers have faced devastating losses, leading to billions in government bailouts. Manufacturers have struggled to compete with rising costs, and families have been left footing the bill. $1 trillion refund might not put money directly into consumers' pockets, but it could help stabilize prices and repair trade relationships that have been fractured over the past few years. As this story unfolds, the stakes couldn't be higher. The outcome will determine not just Trump's legacy, but America's economic future. Will we double down on protectionism, risking more trade wars and higher prices? Or will we reverse course, refunding $1 trillion and signaling a return to global cooperation? This is a decision that will shape the next decade of American politics and economics. What we're witnessing is a rare moment in history. Tariffs were once a niche topic, something only economists and trade lawyers debated. But under Trump, they became a symbol of his presidency, a rallying cry for his supporters, and a weapon in America's economic arsenal. Now, those same policies are threatening to unravel everything he built. In the coming months, expect this story to dominate headlines. Expect Trump to double down, framing this refund battle as proof that he's under attack from powerful elites. Expect Democrats and Republicans to clash over how to handle this crisis. And expect global markets to react to every new development. As this fight over tariffs escalates, Washington is bracing for chaos. Behind closed doors, lawmakers are strategizing, lobbyists are flooding Capitol Hill, and corporate leaders are mobilizing like never before. The stakes are enormous, and the messaging is already shifting. Trump's allies are painting this refund as a betrayal of America's workers, while his opponents see it as an overdue correction to a reckless economic gamble. This divide isn't just between parties. It's cutting straight through both Democrats and Republicans, splitting Congress into factions that represent wildly different visions of America's future. Some Republicans, once champions of free trade, are now firmly entrenched in Trump's protectionist vision. They argue that this trillion-dollar refund would signal weakness, embolden foreign powers, and undo the leverage Trump fought to build. But other conservatives are quietly admitting what economists have said all along. Tariffs are hidden taxes on American families, and continuing down this road may cripple small businesses and drive prices even higher. Democrats, meanwhile, are navigating a tightrope of their own. While many opposed Trump's tariffs from the start, few want to be seen as handing corporate giants a trillion-dollar payday. The optics are dangerous. Millions of Americans are struggling with inflation, rent hikes, and stagnant wages. Explaining why multinational corporations deserve massive refunds is a political nightmare, even for the most polished politician. This is why the White House is playing its cards carefully, leaning toward a compromise that returns some money but not all, while striking new trade deals to rebuild alliances. Internationally, the story is gaining momentum. China, Canada, and Europe are watching every move. For China, this refund battle is vindication, proof that America's attempt to punish them with tariffs has backfired. Canadian officials are using this as leverage in ongoing defense and trade negotiations, pressing for more favorable deals. European leaders see an opportunity to expand their markets while the U.S. is distracted. America's credibility as a trade leader is being tested like never before, and so far, the cracks are showing. But let's step back from the political theater for a moment and talk about what this means for everyday Americans. Tariffs were supposed to protect jobs, but in many industries they had the opposite effect. Small manufacturers found themselves squeezed by skyrocketing material costs, forcing some to shut their doors. Farmers, who once thrived on exports to China, watched their profits vanish overnight as retaliatory tariffs closed markets. The government responded with billions in bailout programs, but for many rural communities the damage was already done. Entire towns across the Midwest and South are still struggling to recover from those trade wars, and a trillion-dollar refund, directed mostly at big corporations, won't erase the pain they've endured. For now, we can only watch as history unfolds in real time. $1 trillion is on the line. The world is watching, and America is at a crossroads. Thank you for watching Traveling Vibes. If you've made it this far, you're part of the few who seek truth beyond the headlines. Make sure you subscribe to Traveling Vibes for more deep dives, hard-hitting analysis, and stories that cut through the noise. Your support helps us keep delivering content that challenges the narrative and gives you the full picture. Stay informed, stay engaged, and stay tuned, because this story is only beginning.